20 minutes after Transworld Airlines Flight 847 takes off, a stewardess in first class hears screams coming from the back cabin. When she opens the curtain, a man sprints towards her, kicks her to the ground, and drags her all the way to the cockpit. Behind them, another man is holding a handgun and the lock pin of a live grenade between his teeth. If he lets it go, it goes off. Before the stewardess can warn the pilots, the two men kick in the cockpit door and pistol whip the crew. One of them points the gun at the captain and orders him to divert the plane.
Beirut, Lebanon, now!
The hijackers have demands, and they are willing to spill blood to get them. This is how a routine 3-hour flight became the longest airplane hijacking in history. On the morning of June 14, 1985, 3 young, well-dressed Lebanese men were among the many people waiting to board Transworld Airlines Flight 847 at Athens International Airport. They were Muhammad Ali Hamadi, who turned 21 the day before, 22-year-old Hassan Izaldin, and 24-year-old Ali Atwa. All of them were members of Hezbollah, a Lebanese militant group founded 3 years earlier in response to Israel's invasion of Lebanon, which had led to the near-total destruction of the country's southern region and the death and imprisonment of thousands of Shiite Muslims. Hamadi, Izaldin, and Atwa were on a mission to negotiate the release of 766 prisoners held in a prison in northern Israel. For that, they needed hostages, and Flight 847 was the perfect target. It had just flown in from Cairo and was now heading from Athens to Rome, then Boston, with a final destination in Los Angeles. This meant that the majority of the passengers on the flight were American citizens, exactly what they needed to get the United States' attention, and Israel's. At the time, security checks in Athens International Airport were often rushed. For connecting flights, they were sometimes bypassed entirely. And because of this, Hamadi, Izaldin, and Atwa had come in through the transit lounge. Inside their briefcases were 2 9mm handguns and a grenade, which went completely undetected due to fiberglass insulation. However, as they were getting ready to board the plane, an airport security officer scanned Hamadi and Izaldin with a metal detector, which activated the alarm. They immediately thought they were discovered and raised their hands, but the officer didn't suspect anything. He just told them to empty their pockets and go through the detector again. This time, Hamadi and Izaldin put their briefcases down. The scanner didn't find anything suspicious, and they were both allowed through. Behind them, though, an airport employee told the third hijacker, Atwa, that he couldn't board. The plane was full. On board, Hamadi and Izaldin took their seats in the plane's last row. Atwa never arrived, and before long, the pilot announced that Flight 847 was ready for takeoff. Hamadi and Izaldin had to decide now: abort the operation or hijack the plane, just the two of them. 20 minutes after takeoff, Hamadi and Izaldin pulled their handguns and a satchel filled with hand grenades out of their briefcases and began threatening passengers. When Uli Derrickson, the flight service manager, opened the curtain to see why there was so much noise coming from the back cabin, Hamadi sprinted towards her and fly-kicked her in the chest. He dragged her to the cockpit door, and with Izaldin, they kicked it in. Inside were Captain John Testrake, a pilot with 30 years of experience, his first officer, and a flight engineer, who were powerless to stop them. And so at around 10:30 a.m., 28,000 feet in the air, Hamadi and Izaldin had taken control of the TWA Flight 847 and ordered Captain Testrake to redirect it to Beirut, Lebanon. There, they could negotiate. But how did this turn into a 17-day hostage situation? Hamadi and Izaldin's first order was to reposition all 153 passengers, men in window seats and women on the aisle, all of them with their hands behind their heads and their elbows on their knees. Lebanon was Hamadi and Izaldin's home country, but landing there was a very strategic decision. At the time, Lebanon's central government had collapsed, and Beirut, the capital, was divided amongst various rival militias, like Hezbollah. This made it the perfect location because no unified Lebanese authority existed to coordinate with American rescue forces. And even if they did reach Beirut, Hezbollah surrounded the airport. However, when Captain Testrake informed the airport that the hijackers were demanding to go to Beirut, the airport's control tower refused to let them land. In fact, they blocked the runway with buses and blockades. But Hamadi and Izzeldin were determined, and they knew they had negotiating power. First, Hamadi told Derrickson to identify any Jewish passengers on board. When Derrickson said no, Hamadi threatened her, but she knew neither one of the hijackers spoke much English. Hamadi spoke German, and so did she, so they needed her to communicate, and she absolutely refused to do it. However, Hamadi went through the passports himself and began moving several passengers he thought had Jewish-sounding names to the front cabin, hurting them as he found them. Apart from this, Hamadi also found 6 U.S. Navy divers. But as the plane approached Beirut International, the control tower officials still refused to move the buses and blockades from the runway. Because of this, Captain Testrake told them,
"He has pulled a hand grenade pin and he is ready to blow up the aircraft if he has to. We must, I repeat, we must land at Beirut. No alternative."
Despite this, the control tower denied the landing, so Captain Testrake told them that they didn't have enough fuel to go anywhere else, and he was going to land anyway. The Lebanese officials understood that they didn't have a choice, so they gave in. Hijackers may thrive on chaos, but your business needs to stay organized. That's where Odoo comes in. Odoo is an all-in-one platform that lets you run your entire business from a single place. Whether it's sales, marketing, accounting, HR, inventory, or project management, Odoo has an app for it, and they all work together seamlessly. Instead of juggling a dozen different software subscriptions that don't talk to each other, Odoo gives you one integrated suite where everything connects. That means less hassle, fewer errors, and more time to focus on actually growing your business. Your first Odoo app is free, forever, with unlimited users. You can try Odoo for free today using the top link in the description, or scan the QR code on the screen to get started. Thank you to Odoo for sponsoring this video. Flight 847 had landed in Beirut at 11:57 a.m., and once on the ground, the hijackers made their demands.
They want 200 sandwiches, 150 apples, and 88 pounds of bananas. But they want the fuel first and make it fast. The plane is booby-trapped. If anyone approaches, they will detonate. They say there is no alternative. Either the plane is refueled or it will be destroyed.
To this, the airport officials answered that they wouldn't comply if they didn't release hostages. But the hijackers wouldn't listen. Derrickson knew that she built some rapport with the hijackers. She had talked to them, offered to make them tea and food, and even sang to them in German at times. So she asked them to release all women and children. They refused, but she asked again, this time to release the elderly women and children. The hijackers still refused, but she asked for a third time, and they agreed. After the officials agreed to the exchange, Derrickson rounded up 17 elderly women and 2 children and led them down the plane's emergency slide. Now, Hamadi and Izzeldin knew that every minute they spent on the ground gave American intelligence agencies more time to plan a rescue operation, and the airport was taking too long with their fuel. Because of this, the hijackers brought 2 of the U.S. Navy divers to the cockpit area, and using an armrest they had torn off the flight engineer's seat, they began beating them senseless. Captain Testrake urged the officials.
They are beating the passengers. They are beating the passengers. They are threatening to kill them now. They are threatening to kill them now. We want the fuel now, immediately.
They answered that they were trying to get them the fuel as fast as they could, but it was only after hours on the ground that they finally began refueling the plane, and Hamadi and Izzeldin stopped beating the Navy divers. When Derrickson tried to bandage them, they stopped her.
American must suffer! Must suffer!
While the airport officials refueled the plane, Captain Testrake told them that the hijackers wanted the runway cleared for takeoff at dawn. When the control tower asked his destination, his response was, "I don't know." Even though Hamadi and Izzeldin could get Hezbollah's support in Beirut, being there exposed them to Israeli or US commando raids. So once the plane was in the air, they told Testrick to direct the plane to Algiers. Over the years, Algeria had earned a reputation as a neutral mediator in hostage crises involving the Middle East. The hijackers believed it would allow them to land safely and even help broker their negotiations. But as they were flying there, Algeria closed down the airport instead. However, US President Ronald Reagan reached out directly to its president, President Chadli Benjedid, and he allowed the landing. The hijackers landed in Algiers around 3:30 p.m. and made their official demands. They wanted the release of 766 prisoners taken during Israel's invasion of Lebanon, the release of the 17 men involved in the bombing of the US Embassy in Kuwait, the withdrawal of all Israeli forces from South Lebanon, and the international condemnation of Israel and the United States for their roles in the invasion of Lebanon. While Algerian officials communicated these demands to international governments, Hamadi and Izzeldin negotiated the release of 22 more hostages in exchange for fuel. However, even after releasing them, the airport officials refused to refuel the plane without getting paid for it, and Transworld Airlines didn't have a Shell Oil account in Algiers. The plane was stuck for now, but the hijackers had a violent solution. As they continued searching the plane for information about the passengers, Hamadi found a sports coat with a red US passport, which meant that somewhere on board this plane was a US diplomat. The passport belonged to Kurt Carlson, a 41-year-old Army Reserve major returning to the US from a routine survey in Cairo. When Hamadi realized Carlson was on board, he told the passengers to identify him, but everyone remained silent.
Sagen Sie ihnen, dass wir den Besitzer dieses Passes sofort töten werden, wenn sich nicht zu erkennen gibt, bis wir ihn erreichen.
They're saying if the owner of this passport doesn't reveal himself by the time we get to him, he will face severe consequences.
When no one responded, Hamadi and Izzeldin began moving through the aisle from the back row, comparing each face to the passport's picture and pointing their guns at everyone as they moved. Carlson remained silent. But when Hamadi reached the row behind him, he had no choice but to stand up and identify himself. Hamadi placed his gun on Carlson's forehead and said,
CIA or FBI?
Carlson answered,
No, Army Reserve.
Hamadi stared into Carlson's eyes for some seconds, until Derrickson slipped between them and he lowered his weapon, choosing instead to take him to the cockpit area. Here, both hijackers blindfolded him in a corner and began attacking him, striking his head and shoulders with the same armrest they had used on the Navy divers. As this was happening, Captain Testrick begged the airport officials to supply them with fuel, but the airport insisted on a payment. So once again, Derrickson put her own life in danger by intervening.
Don't you hit that person. Why do you have to hit those people?
This time, though, they wouldn't listen to her. Captain Testrick begged. He promised that the US Embassy would pay for the fuel, and even put his microphone as close as he could to Carlson so the control tower could hear him scream. But the airport officials still refused. Hamadi and Izzeldin assaulted Carlson for nearly 4 hours, until they took him to the open door of the plane and pointed their guns at his head, demanding the fuel and threatening to eliminate one passenger every 5 minutes until they got the fuel. It didn't matter. The Algiers airport insisted on payment, but with lives on the line, Derrickson couldn't bear to wait anymore. She asked the hijackers permission to get her personal credit card from her purse and paid $5,500 for 6,000 gallons of fuel. When airport officials finally refueled the plane, Hamadi and Izzeldin stopped beating Carlson, but it didn't take long for them to realize that Algeria wouldn't give them what they wanted. Apart from the hassle with the fuel, they refused to grant them asylum, and they showed no signs of pressuring Israel to release the prisoners. So just hours after landing, the hijackers told Captain Testrick to fire up the engine and fly them back to Beirut. Even though this meant risking a US or Israeli raid, it was the only place where Hamadi and Izzeldin had Hezbollah's protection. At this point, Kurt Carlson knew that if the US and Israel kept refusing the hijackers' demands, they would hurt him even more. So during the flight back, he asked Derrickson to tell Hamadi that he had a wife and baby daughter waiting at home. His reaction was strange. Hamadi hugged Carlson and said that he didn't want to harm him, but he needed to convince the airport authorities to bring fuel. Hamadi apologized, gave him water, and told him that he also had a wife and a daughter, but they passed away during the Israeli and US airstrikes in southern Lebanon, and his brother too. This moment of compassion was brief. Hamadi and Izz-al-Din worried that the passengers would stop fearing them, so during the flight, they dragged Robert Stetham, one of the US Navy divers they had already hurt, to first class. One of the hijackers took off his shirt, cut it into small strips so he could blindfold him, and tied his hands with elastic cords from a suitcase. The hijackers dragged Stetham to the cockpit door and began hitting him repeatedly. They wanted the passengers to hear him scream, so they held the microphone to his face. But incredibly, no matter how much or how hard Hamadi and Izz-al-Din hit him, Stetham didn't make a sound. As the plane approached Beirut, the airport officials once again refused to let the hijackers land, this time switching off the lights from the runway. Captain Testrake told the control tower that the plane was running out of fuel and that there was no other place where he could land.
The situation is desperate. We are almost out of fuel. I implore you, sir, to cooperate and allow where we crash.
Still, their answer was no. So in response, one hijacker grabbed the radio and screamed,
If you don't let us land, we will crash the plane.
Beirut Airport had no choice but to turn the runway lights back on. Flight 847 made its second landing in Beirut at around 2:20 a.m. Hamadi and Izz-al-Din knew they couldn't continue this operation on their own, and even though Hezbollah was one of Beirut's biggest militias, it couldn't help the hijackers negotiate. However, the Amal movement, a Shiite militia and political party, was bigger and had the resources to continue the operation. Hezbollah and the Amal movement were the biggest representatives of the Lebanese Shiite community, and both wanted the liberation of the Shiite prisoners from Israel, but they had a tense and complicated relationship. Once the hijackers arrived in Beirut, they demanded more fuel and for an Amal movement official to join them on the plane. But initially, both the control tower and the Amal movement ignored this. So Hamadi took Stetham again and led him to the cockpit, where once again, he and Izz-al-Din tried to force him to scream into the radio's microphone. But once again, Stetham stayed quiet, and the control tower rejected their demands. This is when Izz-al-Din gave Hamadi what sounded like an order. He took him to the plane's door, opened it, and fired. Stetham fell to the tarmac, and a second shot followed before Hamadi went back inside.
Tell them!
He just killed a passenger! He just killed a passenger!
You see, you now believe it! There will be another in 5 minutes!
Immediately, the hijackers brought another Navy diver into the cockpit and began hurting him. Derrickson tried intervening again, but they didn't stop until they finally saw an Amal movement official and his bodyguard approach the plane. Once they were on board, Hamadi and Izz-al-Din ordered the control tower to turn off the lights from the runway, and while under the cover of darkness, around a dozen members of Hezbollah snuck onto the airport runway and boarded the plane with more weapons and ammunition. Some of them went back, taking 7 Americans with Jewish-sounding names to a Hezbollah-controlled prison in Lebanon. Those 7 hostages were their insurance, and the rest of their passengers were their bargaining chips, because they needed to use them one more time. It was only after that Hamadi and Izz-al-Din told the control tower that the Red Cross could retrieve Sthetham's body, which had laid on the tarmac for over 2 hours. And then they told Captain Testrake, once again, to fly the plane to Algiers. The hijacking of Flight 847 was meant to be a 3-man operation, but since the flight was full, Ali Atwa, the 3rd hijacker, was not allowed to board the plane back in Athens. When Atwa tried to force his way into the plane, he was arrested by airport security, who discovered he was carrying weapons, and once news of the hijacking broke, Greek authorities quickly connected him to it. Flight 847 left Beirut for the second time at 5:40 a.m. on June 15th. But before leaving, Hamadi and Hassan told the control tower that they would eliminate one Greek hostage for every hour that Atwa remained in prison. Greece immediately flew Atwa to Algiers, where they could make official negotiations. When Hamadi, Izzeldin, and now the rest of Hezbollah arrived in the morning, Algeria let them land on the condition that there would be no further violence, and they agreed. On the ground, 2 Algerian officials boarded the plane to negotiate. However, neither the Israeli nor the US governments were answering any of the hijackers' demands. In reality, the Reagan administration was preparing a strike force in Italy for a potential rescue operation. But before they could do anything, the US ambassador in Algeria sent Washington a message saying,
"Tell Secretary Schultz that under no circumstances should this strike force try to rescue these people by force. The Algerians will resist, and certainly the hijackers will blow up the plane. It will be a disaster."
In the end, the hijackers agreed to release 65 passengers and all 5 female flight crew members, including Uli Derrickson, in exchange for Ali Atwa, who boarded the plane and joined the hijackers on their final flight, back to Beirut. On June 16th, the hijackers and their 39 remaining hostages returned to Beirut International Airport. Negotiations that day were unsuccessful. So the next day, the Reagan administration sent an aircraft carrier and a guided missile destroyer to the coast of Lebanon, where the US Marines would be awaiting orders for a rescue mission. Before they could arrive, though, the hijackers hatched a plan. A handful of hijackers would remain in the plane with the cockpit crew, but all remaining hostages from the plane would be taken to Beirut and dispersed throughout neighborhoods controlled by Hezbollah. This ensured that even if the Marines rescued the hostages in one safe house, Hezbollah could eliminate the rest. And at the same time, Hezbollah transferred the custody of some hostages to Nabi Berri, the leader of the Amal movement. Despite their differences, Hezbollah and Berri both wanted Israel to free the Shiite prisoners, so they ultimately agreed to cooperate.
Nabi Berri is no longer a mediator between the hijackers and the United States. He is now the negotiator, the man that the U.S. must deal with if it wants the hostages back. But Berri has his price. He can't afford to let the hostages go without getting something in return. And that something is the return of more than 700 Lebanese, mostly Shiites, in a prison in northern Israel.
All the passengers are outside the plane now. Where are they now? In one place in Beirut.
The Reagan administration now knew that a ground operation was off the table, so they told the Navy to stay on the coast, threatening that if any more American hostages were harmed, they were ready to bombard Beirut. Hezbollah had managed to neutralize the world's most powerful military, and now they were daring the Reagan administration to break their rule, that America does not negotiate with terrorists. On June 18th, President Ronald Reagan opened a press conference with a statement about the hostage situation.
1 hour ago, the body of a young American hero Navy diver, Robert Dean Statham, was returned to his native soil in a coffin after being beaten and shot at point-blank range. The United States is tonight a nation being attacked by international terrorists and who wantonly kill and who seize our innocent citizens as their prisoners. Let me further make it plain to the assassins in Beirut and their accomplices, wherever they may be, that America will never make concessions to terrorists.
Reagan claimed that he would never negotiate with the hijackers, but with the hostages scattered across Beirut, a ground rescue operation was impossible. But the situation would only get worse. Later that day, Nabi Berri announced the release of 3 Greek hostages, showing that he could end the crisis whenever he chose to, as long as his demands were met. It was an open invitation for Israel and the US to negotiate, but they refused. A day later, ABC News conducted an exclusive interview with Captain Testrake from the airport's runway.
Captain Testrake.
district, can you tell me what has happened to you and what's happening to you now?
Not very much is happening to us now since Sunday night, because they removed the other passengers and took them away, and the three of us have been on the aircraft since then.
And many people in America are calling for some kind of rescue operation or some kind of retaliation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that we'd all be dead men if they did, because we're continually surrounded by many, many guards.
The interview was broadcast worldwide. It confirmed that the hostages were spread across Beirut and that a U.S. military intervention was impossible. Seeing this, Barry understood that the press was putting even more pressure on the Israeli and the U.S. administrations. So the next day, at Beirut International Airport, he brought out 5 American hostages for another press event.
My name is Alan Conwell from Houston, Texas. I am one of the hostages taken on Flight 847 that's here now in Beirut. We do sincerely pray that the governments involved in this problem can put aside fear, anger, and insult in the process of rectifying the wrongs committed to date.
This showed that it wasn't only Barry and the hijackers who wanted the U.S. to negotiate, but also the hostages themselves. However, their demand was clear. They would only let the Americans go if Israel released all 766 Shiite prisoners, no less. Israel, for their part, announced that it would be willing to consider this trade, but only if the U.S. made a public request. Of course, the Reagan administration refused, but the pressure on them was mounting. And although they would never admit it, they were already looking for ways to end the crisis, even if it meant bending their own rules. On June 23rd, 10 days after the initial hijacking, Israel announced that it would release 31 Lebanese prisoners the next day. However, Barry made clear that he wouldn't even consider a partial deal. Hoping for an equal gesture, Israel did release the hostages. But in response, Barry only made his stance stronger, asserting that he wouldn't free any hostages until all 766 Shiite prisoners were released, and the U.S. withdrew its warships from the Lebanese coast. While the U.S. kept making hidden negotiations, Barry kept using the media to pressure them. On June 27th, ABC News interviewed 3 more hostages. The next day, they interviewed 14 more. And as negotiations progressed, Barry announced that he believed the crisis could end in the next 48 hours. Without any public statement from the U.S. or Israel, a report from Beirut on June 29th claimed that a United Nations official had negotiated the release of the Shiite prisoners in Israel, on the condition that the United States wouldn't retaliate against Lebanon once the hostages were released. By June 30th, they had agreed. Israel would free the rest of the Lebanese Shiite prisoners 1 month after Barry released the hostages, and the United States could claim that it made a deal with the United Nations, not with the hijackers. After 17 grueling days, all 39 remaining American hostages were collected from various locations throughout Beirut and transported to Syria, where they would be returned to the U.S. 2 days later, President Reagan held a ceremony to celebrate their freedom and made a statement during the press conference.
I know you care deeply about Robbie Steedham and what was done to him. We will not forget what was done to him. There will be no forgetting. His murderers must be brought to justice.
After the hijacking of TWA Flight 847, Hamadi, Izzeldin, and Atwa disappeared into Beirut, where no military force could reach them. But they wouldn't stay hidden forever. 3 years later, 6 Lebanese men hijacked Kuwait Airways Flight 42, which led to a 16-day hostage situation across 3 continents. One of the men was Izzeldin, who managed to escape. The year after that, Hamadi was captured in Frankfurt, carrying liquid explosives for an attack. The United States petitioned to extradite him and be judged on American soil, where he would surely face the death penalty. However, Hamadi's brother kidnapped 2 German citizens in Beirut, and in exchange for their release, Germany chose to judge him under their laws. In 1989, Hamadi was sentenced to life in prison for murder, air piracy, and hostage-taking. But he was released on parole 16 years later and returned to Lebanon, where he was beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. By 2006, all 3 hijackers were on the FBI's wanted list, with a reward of $5 million for information leading to their arrest. But they were never found. In 2021, the Times of Israel reported that Ali Atwa had died of cancer. And in 2025, 40 years after the hijacking of Flight 847, reports suggested that Hamadi was shot outside his home, although Lebanese authorities have not released any official information or identified suspects. Today, both Hamadi and Izzeldin remain on the FBI's wanted list, with a $5 million reward.